Good morning. Let me add my welcome to all of you as well. I was told by a colleague when I first became a president, we were at a symposium and there was an 8 a.m. start, and he said that the earlier the start for a symposium or a colloquium, the more important the introductory speaker. And I thought, well, that's got a fair amount of ego attached to it, to think that you'll pull people out of hotel rooms earlier and get them in. And he must have sensed that from the look on my face that I had some skepticism about that. And he said, no, I mean, they have to know that their only role is to allow people to clear the coffee and food line and to get settled before the actual speakers start. So, fully cognizant of what my role is here this morning, I did want to take a moment and welcome you all and share just a couple thoughts. The new title for this year got me to thinking about transitions. Every summer I do a statewide tour, and when we were in the northeast part of Colorado this year, one of the things that county commissioners are really struggling with are decreases in valuation of property based on changes in the oil and gas industry. Now, this is an area that has classically been one of the most agriculturally productive parts of Colorado, indeed of the nation. And at a time when there is dramatic interest in food and the value of this land from an agricultural perspective continues to increase, it's very interesting that this new connection between food and energy and water is interacting in a way that's causing major transitions in the way that these county commissioners and these communities and these farmers and ranchers in that part of our state think about the future that's ahead of them. If we went back to about the time this symposium started, maybe a little before that, some of the best and brightest people in the energy industry that I know were making decisions based upon historic linkages between natural gas prices and oil prices, and yet I don't think many people anticipated that there was about to become an uncoupling of those prices, and that would lead to transitions within an industry that I think very few people anticipated. One of the things about a college campus that I have always loved is that there are so many young people and there's such an influx of energy and hope and ideas. And the flip side of that coin, of course, is that every fall I'm reminded that while we on the faculty are timeless and don't age, the students are in fact getting younger and younger and younger in a relentless march. But when we were their age and we were taking classes, which now it seems longer ago than I would have thought, one of the biggest challenges in the geopolitical sense would have been foreign oil and dependence on foreign oil. And yet we find ourselves now in a transition to being an energy producer, and many of the issues that our military leaders grapple with around national security deal with issues of global food instability and insecurity, of water issues around the globe, and those related to energy. And so we have a transition in national security and then the national policy around that as well. If we went back just a little bit before that time, it would have been very difficult, given the discussions that were going on about the developing countries in China and India, to envision the tremendous growth that's occurred in those countries. And lacking the knowledge that we have today about carbon and climate and those sorts of issues, it would have been very difficult for us to predict that this summer, when I, on the statewide tour, went through parts of western Colorado, I would see a county in Delta County that is really struggling with the transitions that are going on in the coal industry. As some of those mines have closed, we have an ag experiment station in that part of the state, and it's literally a barrage of for sale signs as one goes through that county. And I think that the barrage of those for sale signs reflects the tremendous transition that community, that those families and the leaders from that community are struggling with. Last week, so that's a march sort of backwards in time and then a jump forward to where we're at today. Juxtaposed on that, last week my office received 4,166 signed petitions from our students urging us to sign on to a pretty aggressive climate action plan. And we'll take a hard look at it. There's a lot to like about that plan. It's an important plan. But there are also a lot of implications that we need to do our due diligence on. And yet I'm reminded that this is a generation that I am a huge fan of, including the fact that one of their strongest suits is not patience. I'll share just a couple thoughts about that. This generation does not have confidence that traditional retirement plans, economics, approaches to a career in business is going to take care of them when they reach old age. And I was stunned by the statistic released about a month ago that this generation has put away at an earlier age more money for their own retirements than any previous generation since that has been tracked. They're not willing to wait and trust in our systems. I'm willing to bet that most of you wouldn't have thought that I would bring up same-sex marriage this morning. That's an issue that our generation struggled with, continues to struggle with. And I would have gone back 5 years and said it's a fairly intractable social-political issue for us as a society. And yet this next generation has largely told us, you all go ahead and continue to debate that. It's a done issue as far as we're concerned, and we're going to move on. 86% of our entering freshman class says that the single highest priority and issue that our world faces is the environment. What makes us think that they'll be patient? And what makes us think that the choices that they will make, the behaviors that they will exhibit, the pressures that they will bring to bear, won't influence the discussions we're having now? At the least, they will inject a sense of urgency. At the most, they may induce change that we're not anticipating that may result in a whole new series of transitions that we'll be discussing here. So in the midst of all of that, while we stand here, you all as practitioners in this space in the public and private sector and the policy sphere, as we sit in the midst of this tremendous amount of swirling change, usually when I'm confronted with that amount of challenge, I take a step back and I say, all right, we know what's in the liability column. What do we have in the asset column? So I made the mistake of emailing my staff a couple of days ago to prepare for this. And I said, just refresh my memory. Send me some bullets on the key things we've got going on in the energy space so I can mention a few of them. And I was sorely tempted to read you the 8 pages of single-spaced material they sent. I need to review with my staff the concept of bullets. But that's our asset column, right? Not just at Colorado State, and not just at all the other universities in this state or in this region or in this country, but in the private sector as well and in the policy sphere. We have tremendous numbers of people working on this, and we have science and technological tools to bring to bear, including those in the social and behavioral sciences that we've never had. So as we deal with these transitions, as we struggle with this tremendous amount of change and these great challenges before us, we also have tools that have never been available as well. And in that light, the question that comes before a symposium like this isn't so much what are the right answers today, because there are so many variables and so much change, and we are in transition in so many different ways. The right area, the right approach, it seems to be one that academia frequently takes. When our Faculty Council's Executive Committee gets ready to send an issue to the floor of the Faculty Council, they don't ask the question as they vote around whether it's ready to go forward. They don't ask the question of whether they support it, whether they think it's a good idea or a bad idea. The question that they ask is this idea sufficiently framed and structured to sustain debate? And it seems to me that's the question in front of all of us today. The topics that are here, all of this swirl of change and transitions and all of the issues that we face around this topic are sufficiently framed to sustain debate. We have tools to bring to bear around them. And that's the task that I think sits before all of you. Not just today and not just tomorrow, but well into the future, is to sustain that debate. Because we know with our history as a land-grant university that while the answers to problems that we face may not be known to us today, when we bring the best minds, when we bring the next generation, when we bring people from across large numbers of fields together, and we sustain a debate, we get those answers right. We move the needle a lot more often than we fail. So my thanks to all of you for being here, participating in that debate. To our sponsors in particular, thank you very much for making this possible. To our speakers who will follow if I ever close my mouth and get off the stage. And I do see the coffee line is empty now, so I have fulfilled my major task as the introductory speaker in a successful manner. With that, I'll welcome you to our campus and introduce Dr. Alan Rudolph, our Vice President for Research, who will moderate the next panel. Alan?
I think we're on now. Good morning. Thank you, Tony. As Tony said, I am Alan Rudolph, Vice President of Research here at Colorado State. And it's my pleasure to moderate this first session this morning entitled Megatrends in Energy Sources and Uses. And I'm joined on the stage here. I'll do some brief introductions and say a little bit about what our panel intends to do this morning. Let the speakers do a little bit of introduction, and then I'll cajole some discussion out of the stage here, and perhaps we'll have time for a question or two. So I'm going to start to my immediate left and introduce Doug Arendt, the Executive Director of the Joint Institute for Strategic Energy Analysis at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Golden. Doug is the Executive Director of the Joint Institute for Strategic Energy Analysis there, and is a Senior Visiting Fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and serves on the AAAS Center Steering Committee on Social Sciences and Alternative Energy. To Doug's left is David Eves, the President of Xcel Energy in Colorado, and he served as President and CEO of Southwestern Public Service Company. And to his immediate left is Christoph Ruhl, who, like me, is probably the most jet-lagged in the room, just having arrived from Abu Dhabi last night, and I arrived from Beijing. And he's responsible, he's a global head of research at the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, and responsible for creating and leading a new global research function designed to provide economic, geopolitical, and energy market analysis. So we have a very esteemed panel going from the state of Colorado all the way internationally to Abu Dhabi. And I think what we intend to do, as the title says, is talk about mega trends, but I know yesterday was full of vibrancy and lots of information about where we're headed with energy transitions. I think what we want to do in this panel is sort of challenge ourselves a bit and talk about what are some of the issues that we face, or barriers perhaps, in terms of meeting some of the goals and optimism that have been set, especially around some of the accords recently signed in Paris and some of the issues that we face regionally, from a nation, and internationally in meeting those goals. And we have a very rich panel to sort of trove that. We'll be looking at issues of pricing, of alternatives, some of the challenges the industry faces in meeting these goals and working with industry, and talk about some of the stakeholders and roles that each of us play. We have a very diverse audience, and fortunately a very diverse panel here on the stage. So I'm going to start out and turn to my immediate left and let Doug do a few introductory comments. We'll go right down the row here and end off with Christoph, and then I'll start with some questions that may tease out some of these challenges that face us. So let me start with Doug.
Great. Thanks, Alan. Good morning to everyone. I'm going to start with maybe 4 key points, slightly on the glass half full side, and then we'll come back to the glass half empty side as well as we get through the conversation. So as you may know, there was a pretty substantial change in the international dialogue around climate and energy last December in Paris that really went from a top-down approach to a bottoms-up approach, and has changed the landscape tremendously. The countries, now all countries essentially, because it's moving into now an enforcement mode, have contributed what they call nationally determined contributions, which are essentially their own goals and policies around energy transition, and how those address not only local issues but contribute to the climate. And if you look at those in total, there are a couple of key things that come out, and I'll just highlight those. The first is that there is an enormous continued growth in energy, particularly in Asia and pending in Africa, depending upon the economic development aspects there. The second, on the source side, is that natural gas and renewables are poised to continue a significantly strong growth, where they are both poised to grow in double digits between now and 2030, 2040. If you look at the analysis from the International Energy Agency, renewables actually are anticipated to grow from their analysis to more than 50% of worldwide power by 2040, from about 10 or 12% today. Pretty enormous. But coal and petroleum will also grow, and that's predominantly also because of the growth in Asian countries. And so there's an ongoing debate about what to do with the carbon in that system and in the total energy system past these first stages of contributions. And I think that's important to think through. Along with that, there are significant cost reductions. Of course, we're familiar with the gas landscape here domestically. Also globally, overall gas prices have decreased, but not nearly as significant as they are here. We can talk about what that looks like across the world and the decoupling of oil and natural gas prices as well. I think that's important. And renewables, as many of you may be familiar with, have continued their price decline and performance increases pretty dramatically, so that in countries as far as Abu Dhabi, South Africa, Mexico, you're seeing prices in power purchase agreements as low as 2.5 or 3 or 4 cents per kilowatt hour coming from wind and solar farms. Pretty dramatic. The second major trend coming out of Paris is that power transition will really be the low-hanging fruit driving the near-term climate targets and climate goals. There will be continued movement in electric vehicles, hybrid electric vehicles itself, but there's some not so ripe fruit, shall we say, left in the medium and heavy duty fleet, airplanes, industry, particularly heavy industry and others, which is really a significant area for R&D, and we'll get to innovation, I think, at some point in time as well. I think the third piece, which really isn't Paris, but it's a reflection of the fact that I work in many countries around the world, and NREL does as my colleagues as well, is that learning has accelerated exponentially in terms of understanding the applicability of technologies, policy, finance, new business models, investment models, et cetera. And that there is instant almost sharing of examples and experiences, both positive and negative, and I think David will talk about some of his in particular here, and that everyone still has to, quote, do it themselves, but they're at least reading and listening and learning and open to exploration. And the fourth one that was mentioned just briefly last night by the Deputy Secretary is a real significant enthusiasm for continued innovation, almost a call to charge, shall we say. And she mentioned mission innovation, which was a doubling of clean energy R&D by 20 country leaders plus the European Union. There was also a complementary announcement with new invigorating investment from the private sector, particularly a number of billionaire who want to invest in clean energy venture capital globally as well. And so I think these pieces are going to come together, again, in the glass half full side. We'll come back to the glass half empty side, but maybe that'll get us started.
Good morning. I'm David Eves, and I'm the president of Xcel Energy Colorado. Let me give you just a little perspective about our company. Xcel Energy owns and operates 4 different utilities. We serve about 3.5 million electric customers in 8 states and almost 2 million natural gas customers. We feel like we've been pretty progressive over the last 10 to 15 years. We've been the #1 wind energy provider in the nation for the last 12 straight years, according to AWEA. We have reduced our carbon emissions by 24% since 2005, and current plans, which we're pretty sure will not hold, we'll end up with new plans that go even further, but our current official plans get us to 40% or more reduction by 2030. So we will, by 2018, we will have retired 25% of our coal fleet. We started out with a lot, so we still have a ways to go. But we feel like we've been in this process for some time and have quite a bit of expertise and view about how to do it. I really appreciate President Frank's opening comments about the dichotomy and some of the diversity that exists between coal communities here in Colorado, our young people. We see that across the 8 states that we operate in, with a wide range of policies and political perspectives, from coal-producing states, more conservative areas of the country. We serve North Dakota, we serve Wisconsin, through Texas, New Mexico, to probably more progressive areas like Colorado and Minnesota. But even within each of those areas, there is this strong dichotomy, and we find ourselves as a utility serving, in my case, 1.4 million electric customers, ranging in wants and needs from low cost, reliable, and different ideologies. We find ourselves in the interesting position of trying to meet a lot of different customer stakeholder needs. So I think it's given rise to a wide range of customer choice programs, moving the meter, backing up the truck, adding low-cost renewables to the system, making the right choices about our central production fleet as we modernize, but at the same time, advancing distributed energy resources, creating programs, community solar gardens, things like that were created right here in Colorado to meet the diverse needs of our customers. So it's like a juggling act, trying to balance all these different interests and move forward. But I think that we have a tremendous opportunity with policies in place, with tax credits, with technology and cost changes that have occurred and what things look like. I think the next 4 to 8 years will result in a dramatic increase in the amount of renewable energy on the system. I think it's going to put a lot of pressure on both gas and coal. There's going to be a lot of market share shift. However, long term, I think it sets us up for some, well, we'll talk about more of this later, but I think there's some great battles and a lot of change coming.
I think Christoph has a few slides that he wants to show for the backdrop of his comments. So if we could go to those slides, that'd be great. Thanks, Christoph.
I would just need something to click them forward. But otherwise, you have to use your imagination. That's fine, too. Good morning, and thank you for having me here all the way over. I was asked to look a little bit at the international, the global perspective of that, and I want to make a few very simple points to start us off with, similar to Doug's points. And I think I better preface them. I've been through so many very emotional debates about proponents of climate change theories, the antagonists, and they have become, at least in Europe, increasingly agronomists. So I'm an agnostic. I don't understand climate science. I don't think anyone does. But I do think that the accumulated evidence and the concerns of those who should know better is serious enough so that we should assume we have a problem. So what I'm going to say, take that as a dose of realism, not as advocacy of some sort. The first point concerns the relationship globally, everything from the global perspective, of where we stand between economic growth, energy consumption, and carbon emissions. At this point, see, the slides are useful because now I would have asked you to imagine a scissor, and instead you can just look at the left-hand side. What we have seen for a long time now, here it's from the 1990s, is fairly steady economic growth worldwide, driven to some extent lately by these countries in Asia and so on. But that's distinctively good news. I think all of us want economic growth rather than no growth. Now, at the same time, that economic growth, and that's what I meant by the scissor, has been made possible with less and less energy consumption growth. Right? That's also good. It just means that we can produce $1 worth of GDP now with much less energy than we could 10, 20, 30 years ago. The third or the second scissor would be if you now imagine carbon emissions caused by that energy consumption. That is a scissor which almost has not moved at all. You see that here at the very bottom. Until a few years ago, you could say that yes, energy consumption per unit of G has declined, but carbon emissions per unit of energy consumed has not, or has very little. So when we globally observe this rise in carbon emissions year after year after year, it has slowed down despite continued high economic growth. But that slowdown is almost totally, almost exclusively the result of higher energy efficiency. It's not yet the result of decarbonizing the fuel mix, the energy we are going to use. And that leads me to the second point. This is actually a very interesting and I think relevant observation for any kind of policy discussion. So let's talk about these two things, energy intensity, the amount of energy you use per unit of GDP, a key variable, call it efficiency for simplicity, and carbon intensity, the amount of carbon you emit per unit of energy. Energy efficiency on the left-hand side, when it goes down, becomes better, has improved greatly all over the world, in all regions, in all countries, and moreover, you see countries converging. Their use of energy per unit of GDP becomes more and more similar. That's also a good thing, because what it does, it reflects the march of technologies across borders. You use whatever you have, and you share that, and it's bought and sold across borders, and so the most efficient technologies spread around the world, and countries' energy consumption per unit of their output, of their GDP, becomes more and more similar, not only better, but more similar. Now you compare that with what we may call carbon intensity, the amount of carbon you need per unit of energy, right? Carbon efficiency, if you want, of the fuel mix. And you see, first of all, it almost hasn't changed, very little compared to the improvements in energy efficiency, broadly speaking. And secondly, there is no convergence, meaning countries which are rich in coal still rely more or less on coal. Countries which are good at renewables, Europe, continue to rely on renewable to an extent nobody else does. Obviously, the technology we are going to talk about in this panel and later on is not distributed around the world in the same fashion as energy savings are. Why would you have that difference? I would argue it reflects a very, very simple fundamental economic principle at work here, which is that energy is costly and carbon, at least so far, is not. Right? So when you have energy being costly, everybody has an incentive to save. I switch off my light when the power bill gets too high, not if it's for free, right? And to use these technologies, and so countries get better and more similar in getting better. But if carbon emissions are free because there is no price for carbon, then that doesn't happen. And then the result of the fuel mix is what countries have, what is cheap, and maybe what is regulated by politics. And that is just not as powerful as market mechanisms are, and that's what we see here. So second point. First one, we are getting better at energy consumption, not at carbon emissions. Secondly, there is a clear difference between the two, probably driven by prices. The third point, I want to see how the fuel mix actually changes. And there's, like in most of these things, glass is half full, glass is half empty, you said. From the global perspective, one has to be realistic. The global fuel mix to date is made 3%, 3.5% perhaps of the global fuel mix to date is made up of renewables. Renewables proper, so I'm excluding nuclear and hydro, and I'm excluding people collecting wood and burning it for free. And if we stick with biomass, solar energy, and wind energy, we have about 3.5%. Even if I were to assume very high growth rates for any kind of individual fuel over a long time, something like 6, 7, 8%, that global fuel mix would still be only 10% driven by renewables, and the rest would be fossil 20 years from now. It's just a base effect. So in other words, globally speaking, we'll be very far away from reaching these Paris targets, and I'll come back to that. It would require more than business as usual. It will require a distinct disruptive technological breakthrough to change that conclusion. One sector which is good to look at when you talk about changes in the fuel mix is the electricity sector. Why? because power generation allows every single fuel to participate, right? You can make power with oil and with gas and with coal and with wind and with solar. So that's like a natural sort of playground in a way, for example, the transport sector, isn't it? First observation globally, that surprised me, but it seems to be true, is to the present day power consumption continues to increase. I thought after you have most of your industrialization done, it doesn't, but it's not true. Continues to go up. And second observation, look at the right-hand side, and don't let ever anyone tell you energy is boring or not changing or so. That's the changing composition of how power has been produced. Historically, of course, dominated by coal to the present day, globally speaking, dominated by coal. Then you have a short pickup of oil, and that was the days when oil was available everywhere and very cheap. It stops right at the point in the late 70s with the OPEC crisis, the oil crisis, when oil gets very expensive. You have a similar burst of nuclear energy, this time driven more or less by regulation and by innovation of our countries trying to make themselves energy independent, then giving up in the face of extremely high costs and also of security risks. And then you see on the right-hand side, this is extrapolated in the future, how the renewable sector takes off. As you said, I think the number was 10% or so, with the hope that in power it will go to 30%. So it is possible, but it's going to be very slow. And it is, of course, in the power sector and with renewables that we have the low-hanging fruits, not in transport, I would argue. And that the low-hanging fruits have been supported by a lot of regulation in some parts of the world. However, last point, even if we make all these heroic assumptions, the same as before, about growth in renewables, for the foreseeable future over the next 20 years, if you look at that, it will still be improvements in energy efficiency more than anything else, which drives less energy use, and through less energy use, less carbon emissions, not changes in the fuel mix. And here, finally, and that's where I want to stop, is what you get when you write forth this rather benevolent scenario where renewables continue to conquer the power sector, grow at about 7% per annum, which is high by historic standards. If that happens, you see where we will end in terms of carbon emissions on the left-hand side, and the red line indicates where we should be ending if we take seriously this climate target of 2 degrees Celsius or 250 particles per million, which has been agreed on Paris. Which would lead me to the conclusion that as we stand here, short of really big disruptive changes, and we're talking something like the steam engine or the internal combustion engine, we will fail to reach that climate change target. Now, why do I say this? Not because I want to be hostile to these attempts, but because I'm observing something, not in the US, where this debate is in an earlier stage and the enthusiasm probably just starts, but in places like my home country, Germany, or Europe in general, which is an increasing amount of cynicism. So many promises have been made, so many shrill warnings have been issued, so many success stories have been sold, that people, when they then 5, 6, 10 years later recognize that the big picture is much slower in changing, become cynic. That's what happens when you disappoint people, and turn their back to this debate. And for this to avoid happening to us here as well, I think we need to be aware of this background. Thank you.
So that was a great introduction by our three speakers. I guess what we want to do now is have a little conversation around some of the topics that were brought up. And I think you've heard both optimism and some cautions around the goals that were set in Paris. I guess I want to start with a discussion of infrastructure and infrastructure development and how you see the infrastructure development piece of meeting these goals. I mean, you mentioned some of the challenges, and share with me some of the things that you see with regard to infrastructure development and meeting these goals from your perspectives, both regionally within the 8-state region, what you see on the national level from an NREL, and then from the international stage, how the different sectors on the renewables, oil and gas, transportation, how do you see them mobilizing infrastructure, investing in infrastructure, some of the challenges of the infrastructure development needed to meet these goals? And I'm happy to start with, perhaps David, you could start there. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll start local and go global. So I think that, look at the electricity sector, and we're facing an outcome from what you described, decreasing energy intensity. Across our states, we typically see 1 to 2% growth in customers per year, but flat to declining sales. And that's because of the increasing energy efficiency, everything from LEDs to more efficient end uses across the board. At the same time, distributed energy resources are driving the need for a much more intelligent grid. We have an old grid. We have a lot of changes to make to it. Upstream of our substations, we have tremendous visibility and control and insight into the operation of the system, but below the substations down into your neighborhoods, there's very little of that. And to accommodate increasing penetrations of rooftop solar, community solar, batteries, all those things, we have to completely rebuild that system. So a lot of cost pressures, but you see energy companies across our country making major investments in the grid and moving in that direction. We're doing it too. As far as the gas infrastructure, a tremendous focus on pipeline safety, integrity, and applying a whole new set of standards and expectations to the older infrastructure that we have in the country. So we're already making those investments, and very appreciative of the fact that low commodity prices, which are anywhere from 50 to 70% of a customer's ultimate cost of gas delivered to them, make it possible to improve the infrastructure. So there's a really different set of pressures and dynamics between gas and electric infrastructure development.
So I'll take a little bit broader perspective, both on the innovation side, but also where we're working with communities across the country. I think on the innovation side, we're seeing a very intense interest in modernization of our infrastructure. So not only electricity, but related energy systems. It could be thermal systems, could be also systems which are used in commercial and industrial, and also the building infrastructure, which is an enormous opportunity for energy efficiency as well. Last night was mentioned a new DOE initiative called the Grid Modernization Initiative. It's a new $200 million plus commitment by the Department of Energy to invest in tools, techniques, and capabilities to really advance the state of the art of our electric grid. And then the second piece, which actually David mentioned, but let me talk about it a little bit more broadly, is that the paradigm of development of our infrastructure, and frankly most of the infrastructure that's been developed in the last century, was really around large-scale, economy of scale, centralized generation facilities, transmission, distribution, kind of one-way power flow, frankly not very smart, not very resilient, not very redundant. And we're seeing today an enormous transition in that paradigm with distributed generation, microgrids, islandable grids, islandable cities, Fort Collins being one to, certainly being part of the leadership of that. And that's not just domestically, there's also a very potent dialogue about this internationally, where every country is watching the distributed generation paradigm evolve in Europe and here, and asking the same question: what policies can we put in place in order to take advantage of, quote unquote, this opportunity, as well as the economic development paradigms that still exist in India and in Africa, et cetera. So that landscape is changing quite dramatically, and it then bleeds into other energy systems. So it's another piece that I think that we're trying to push forward, is this advancing the understanding of what we call energy system integration. So we have typically, because we've had, I'll call it the luxury of thinking of our energy systems as being very independent, power here, transport over here, thermal systems being separate, et cetera. As President Frank mentioned this morning, there's now an appreciating or a growing appreciation of the integration across electricity, thermal systems, gas, and maybe even more complex in the environmental world is energy, food, water, land use change or land use choices, and of course climate change. And that dialogue within the research community and within the decision-making community is actually quite rich. And that is moving forward as well, and we're seeing increasing, I'll call it, aligned and hopefully well thought through codependencies, for lack of a better word, integration across those systems so that they're not independent, but they're also not vulnerably codependent. And so you want to build them to be smart, to be resilient, of course to be affordable, and of course to be environmentally sustainable.
I'll take the wide angle again. I think from there's energy infrastructure and other infrastructure, and concentrating on energy infrastructure. I think from a global perspective, it will be two groups of countries which matter more than anybody else. Very rich countries and very poor countries. And that is because the rich countries have the means to experiment, and the poor countries can do what is called leapfrogging. It's just like if you don't have a fixed telephone system, you get telephones the first time, everybody else has a mobile already. You jump over that stage. You don't need to have telephone lines. Everybody buys a mobile. And I give you an example. A few years ago, again, in Germany, my home country originally, they made, in a spark of political genius, two related decisions. One was to switch off nuclear energy because of the Fukushima disaster. The other was to decarbonize power production faster than anybody else, called energy transition typically. A horrendously difficult and expensive undertaking. In Germany, there was, of course, a developed infrastructure for power generation, with the grid traditionally running from south to west, and that had to be changed now when using wind, and so, from east to west, running from south to north. And they tried to enforce that mostly by regulation, less by price incentives. Learned a lot along the way. For example, about feed-in tariffs. What a terrible instrument they can be. It's like a regressive form of taxation. Feed-in tariff means you give money to those people who in a decentralized way contribute power to the grid, for example, by having a windmill in their garden or a solar panel on their roof, and everybody pays higher tariffs to finance that. That's the theory. The praxis is that you need a roof, and so a house, and you need a garden to get paid, and you're paid by those poor guys who sit in some industrialized, decrepit cities and only have small apartments and still have to pay the higher fees. And that, the more you tighten the screws and speed up the law of unintended consequences. The more you tighten the screws, the more resistance you get. Now, globally speaking, a rich place like Germany, who affords itself all these errors and still goes on with it, doesn't really matter in terms of carbon emissions. It's too small. What matters and why this is so important is because of the signaling effect it has to other poorer places. There are hundreds of millions of people on this planet which do not have access to electricity yet. They have not yet built a grid system which runs from X to Y and then must have to be changed at large expense. They are the ones who are watching these experiments very carefully. If a country like Germany can incur the costs of reworking its grid system, for example, maybe then the costs are more bearable for poor countries who have to yet build a completely new system. That's where the opportunity and the chance is. Now, unfortunately, that's not the flow private investments take or government subsidies take. They are very highly concentrated on those who can afford. And again, the big picture is those who can afford should experiment. It's good for everyone. But the poor ones who haven't built it yet, who don't have the car yet, and may buy electric cars instead of gasoline cars if they are available, those need some help in getting the process started.
So let's turn to innovation, because each of you have mentioned it sort of as the transformative piece of perhaps meeting some of these goals. Christoph, you were perhaps more skeptical about the jump in innovation needed to meet those goals. But I'd love to hear from, again, the regional, national, and international. What do you see as the innovative ecosystem? And is it innovation more in the context of, as you said, the new steam engine, or is it innovation in the integration or processing or integration of renewables? I mean, where are the innovative needs within meeting these goals? I mean, clearly they could be new technologies, but it seems there could be as much innovation in the process or the integration or in the thinking and practice of renewables. And I'd just love to hear your comments on innovation and what's needed. Maybe we'll start at Christoph and come back this way towards Doug.
So innovation, that's the big elephant, because nobody ever has been good at predicting where the next big innovation, we just can't do it. Two things. One is the numbers I showed you are based on a very benevolent assumption about business as usual, continuing cost reduction and so on. That may happen, seems to be happening, but if it happens, it's not enough, at least not enough if compared to the Paris target. The other thing about basic innovation, we seem to have a global problem in that respect. You may be aware of a debate among economists under the heading of secular stagnation, which just takes numbers and observes that global economic growth is slowing since the late 1970s, and relentlessly slowing, no matter how much money is thrown at the problem, no matter how many crises are in between. And economists wouldn't be economists if they wouldn't have 105 reasons for it. But one very important group of reasons centers on the observation that we have very, very slow productivity growth by now, and also continuously coming down. One of the guys who is pushing that and researching that the most, his name is Robert Gordon, is an American. He gives the following example, and that's something worth thinking about also in the energy world. He says, imagine a house in the year 1870. So that house will have no electricity, it will have no plumbing, it will have no mechanized transport, it will have no telecommunication, and so on. Little house on the prairie. Imagine that house 70 years later, 1940. Was an American, so you could imagine 1940, a peaceful house. That house now will have, indoor plumbing, running water, electricity, most likely a mechanized car in the garage, and a telephone. Imagine that same house another 70 years forward, 2010. It will have all the same features, just more refined, plus digitalization, i.e. the internet. And that, he says, is not enough to replicate these huge productivity advancements which we have seen in the 19th and early 20th century, when this confluence of railroads, electricity, steam engine, internal combustion engine created long-lasting improvements in wealth, which are still sort of with us. I have no answer to this observation, whether it's true or not, but I have sort of a healthy dose of skepticism when I look at inventions which have been made lately relating to the energy. There isn't really much new. There is a lot of refinement and a lot of cost improvement. But even that has problems. So the area where, just as a last footnote, the area where I live, sunny like sunny can be, way too sunny. And still, why don't they rely on solar energy? Because there would be too much dust and they need 1,000 people to clean the solar panels, because it's so hot that the transportation of electricity suffers, and. So they would love to do that, but haven't been there yet.
So like Christoph, it's difficult for me to predict like a major innovative breakthrough, when, what it will be. But I look back at the last 10 years and I think about how much things have changed, and it's been a compilation of many, many, many different innovations on different fronts, working for us, being brought to bear, being commercialized. I remember when we added our first 200 megawatts of wind about 16 years ago, and there was a state of concern through the company about how we would manage the thermal generation fleet. What would be the impacts? Is it going to tear up the machines? How do we operate? What if the lights go out? And today, through like scores of advancements, advanced forecasting with federal labs, AGC technology, we actually dispatch wind generation so that you can feather it and control it to control frequency and the real-time balancing of the system. Those are just a few of the small examples. Today in Colorado, in a 8,000 megawatt balancing area that we have to balance moment to moment throughout the hour, we've integrated and operated with 55% of our energy coming from wind in an entire day, and much more than that in any given hour. And that's a combination, it's accomplished through a combination of literally scores of different innovations and changes in technology and advancements. So I see the same thing happening with batteries, I see the same thing happening with solar, increasing penetrations, and the same thing's happening with producers of renewable technologies that continue to drive the cost down, not just through increases in production, but through higher hub heights and design changes.
I'm gonna present the glass half full story relative to Christoph's, which I thought was relevant and a cautionary tale. I think we should be aware of cautionary tales and manage that risk. Let me talk about 4 themes of innovation, which I think are really important. One is technology. We heard a little bit there. The second is in financing and business, which I think is really important. The third is in policy. And the fourth is in expectation. And let me just go through those really quickly. So in technology, I live in a research community. I've been in there for a couple of decades now, and I can tell you stories of advanced solar cells that have 80% efficiency in the lab, that haven't nearly reached their technical potential yet, and certainly aren't in the marketplace yet. That's just on a pure technology piece. All the advancements that David just talked about in wind, et cetera. There are enormous opportunities still in the individual technology pieces. There are even more if you look across that system integration side. If you look in between technology and business models and finance, even if I tell you a little story about innovation in developing countries, because that's where the leapfrogging can go. Part of the challenges we had 20 years ago in Africa, because I was working there, was how do you provide basic energy services, so lighting, communications, television, radio, maybe a little light industry, to a rural village, and potentially healthcare services and things like that. And yet make that affordable and give them a method to pay. And the method to pay is a really interesting question in a nominally cashless society. Back then, the answer was we're going to give them a prepaid meter, we're going to have them walk to their local kiosk, much like they went to buy a Coke, because actually Coke is available virtually everywhere. And they buy a token, much like you buy a token at a car wash or other place. They take that home when they want their power, they put the token in. That was the pay-for-service model back then. Leapfrog 20 plus years now into the future, they have a mobile phone, they pay for their service on the mobile phone, the telephone service turns on the switch in the power system, and it goes automatically all the way through that. So they no longer have to walk 5, 10 minutes or hours to get their token. And more importantly, the business that's now put in this new modern system, the system size is 1/10 because you've gone from incandescent bulbs through compact fluorescence down to LEDs, and you're now charging 5-volt cell phones, not 12-volt household batteries, because you can do LED lighting. And all of the communication services are on 5-volt DC. And so there's an enormous economy of scale there. Add to that the fact that it's probably a CSU graduate who was impatient and said, geez, I have a business model that I'd like to go try. I'm going to use the web to crowdfund my business. I'm going to put my business in as a B Corp, which is a social entrepreneurial corporation in the United States here, or it could be done elsewhere. So there's an enormous landscape on that front. There's also an enormous landscape on innovation in the policy world. So Christoph gave a really excellent example of a hard lesson learned on feed-in tariffs that Germany went through. And many countries, actually every country, knows that lesson and now understands how not to do feed-in tariffs in their world, or how to do it better, let's put it that way. You can have all sorts of interesting financial arrangements around a feed-in tariff. You can go to net metering, you can go to time of use rates, et cetera. So there's a lot of innovation in the policy world as well. And the last one, I'll just, again, reflect back on the expectations, is that graduates today out of this school, out of most schools in the US, and frankly out of many schools around the world that I work in, have a different set of expectations about speed and scale of change, because their lives run at a speed that is so much faster than when I was a child. And I mean, we're all experiencing that. And they expect change to go quickly. And so the business as usual paradigms of the old infrastructure development, et cetera, they are a caution. They are definitely a risk. And if the systems are not put in place, and I call it the innovation systems across that landscape, to enable change to happen not at a business as usual pace, then it is a real risk. But the upside is to turn that upside down and allow that innovation to actually come to market and flourish.
Doug, I love that last point because, you know, we sit in a land-grant university where there's a strong social imperative for change. And we know that the change that we have been talking about within the energy sector and the expectations as a behavioral change are very high. And in fact, in this sector, there's been an introduction of a moral imperative with the papal documents really reflecting on climate change and our moral responsibility. And we know that consumer behavior has such a big role to play in the utility of energy. So I guess the last topic before opening the floor and asking some questions is, from your perspectives, how do you see consumer behavior or the behavior of people in the innovation ecosystem playing a role in setting new megatrends? Do you think the moral imperative that's been introduced around climate change and its effects, do you believe that the connectivity you described in that future home might flatten the earth, so to speak, with regard to awareness around people's usage or behaviors around energy? What do you see with regard to the behavioral aspects that might influence our ability to meet these goals? And do you see, from your perspectives, the introduction of a moral imperative as being a relevant piece of this story? Anyone can start on that one. I know it's a little hard. But,
I'll go back this way. I'll chime in and give these guys a little bit of time to think about that. Actually, it's a really good question. We're actually doing a significant amount of research in what we call human system optimization, which is looking at the individual through institutions and how you can inform individual choice or make recommendations that are more comprehensive, including energy and environment, but also your own concerns. And then how do those work to inform the design and the operation of a system itself? Let me give you an example. It was actually covered in a Washington Post article a little while ago. We produced a paper where we'd done a little research by putting up mock purchase screens of different types of purchases or services that individuals would like to buy, be it a ride share. So would you like to choose a green option? So I don't know how many people have used Uber or Lyft. All right, option. So you know on the bottom there's a little set of options in terms of kind of what service you'd like. Well, what if there were a green service? Or what if you had the option that said, oh, would you like to buy carbon offsets for this particular ride? Turns out that the propensity of people would choose that if it were given as an option, if they care about that, of course, because it may be your personal preferences don't have that as a priority. And if so, how much would you be willing to pay? Turns out, because on a 2-mile or a 10-mile ride, the actual cost of the carbon offset, even if you're in a very large SUV that's got a large carbon footprint, not an electric vehicle, is somewhere on the order of 2 to 20 cents. And so most people would actually opt in to pay something that you would not expect, which is an equivalent carbon tax of $60 or $100 per ton. So when I say it in those terms, most people would kind of gawk and say, wow, that's really expensive, because we would never accept a carbon tax here in the United States or many places elsewhere that would be above $5 or $10 just to get things started. So the individual preference, if people care about it and you give it in a paradigm which they can understand, actually does express that personal preference quite dramatically. And then you can use that throughout the system. You can do it for products that you could purchase in a store. You could do it for actually services. Do you care about having an HD video, which actually has a higher carbon footprint than doing a low version video if you're streaming it at home? You have to tell people that. If they don't know it, they can't choose. So there's one set of examples.
So I think the moral imperative, the values-based decisions is becoming increasingly evident. But we do a lot of research, and our research says customers are going to make those decisions between energy choices or to adopt more efficiency based largely on their beliefs and values, but our experience shows us that it's largely driven by cost and economics. So there's a wide gap between what the research would tell you and the actual customer behavior to, say, opt into renewable energy programs and the like. That's not entirely true, but generally that is the case. One thing we see happening is the collective beliefs of multiple customers beginning to transform itself into community, local community visions, which have a lot more capability, a lot more potential to impact public policy and to drive changes. So we find ourselves working a lot on how do we partner with communities that we serve that have very different objectives in terms of their relative priorities.
So Christoph, what do you see from the Abu Dhabi perspective?
I think this is a really big question, and it's not only consumer choice. You also asked about morality, and I'm a bit cautious when it comes to moral sort of impetus in politics. But from the start, I think first of all, it's clear that consumers, or we all, can change things. There are examples in the energy world. The phasing out of nuclear power, whether it's good or bad, in Japan, in parts of Germany, in parts of Europe, that was driven by consumers saying this is too risky. The counterexample, the failure of introducing a carbon price in the European Union, that was probably something driven by politicians not having the backbone to do what most consumers would probably be willing to take, according to opinion polls and all that. But I want to come back to the scale of the problem. So with all due respect, I think, if you compare crowdfunding with the invention of the joint stock company, when you compare the progress we made in solar energy with the invention of the car, then we do have a problem on the scale which is historic, of historic proportions, but not the same progress yet. Moreover, if we get to that progress somehow, for example, if we manage to invent the battery which gives us the electric car, then there will be winners and losers, of course. And this will be like the mechanical camera. A highly specialized industry doing today's mechanical car will just disappear, and instead there will be components simple to produce in factories, mostly in cheap labor countries. So it's not, even if we had the big breakthrough which we all desire, it's not going to be easy. In that situation, I think, one has to be aware that this is going to be a long, hard slog. That's the most important of all the truths about it. Because when you tell people, this is easy to do and we will manage this tomorrow, when you abuse the optimism of the kids the rector spoke of, the president of the university spoke of, so that will backfire big time. And I think we're seeing that in those countries where this debate has started the earliest. So you shall not trust, any politician who says it's going to be all right, and you need to be informed. What I see again and again, that with all this enthusiasm, the public debate is on a very, very ill-informed level still, poorly informed level when it comes to climate change. It's such a big topic, but how many in the room would have known what the global share of wind energy is, or the US share of solar energy, or basic facts like that? Energy is still a topic which is so important, goes in, literally one of the few things goes into anything we do, but everybody is basically allowed to talk about it without consequences. And I think that's a problem. So that's why I'm always insistent on being aware of the scale of the problem which we have to master, because it will take time, it will not be easy. And ultimately I agree with the two others. We cannot predict whether there will be something falling from the sky which helps us. We can just give it our best and do it gradually, but that means it'll take time.
So we have a few minutes for questions from the audience or comments to any of the speakers. I know there's microphones. I see a hand up over here, and I think a microphone is on its way from behind you.
Hi, my name is Mike Fox from CSU. This is directed primarily to Christoph, I guess, but one of the things that you showed in your slides about, and you referred to nuclear power, and showing that in the past there was quite a push for it in the late 1900s, and it's sort of staying fairly stable. Your comment about needing a technological revolution, and I think many people in the energy area talk about that being necessary. The new forms of Generation 3 and types of nuclear power that are currently being built around the world really have the capability of being increased fairly dramatically without new technological major changes. And as a point of reference, there was a report in the Breakthrough Institute in April that showed that of all the wind and solar that were built in 2015 around the world, compared to 10 nuclear reactors that were built in China and I think one in Russia, that over a lifetime of the total power that would be produced, that it was about the same amount of total power for wind and solar, and nuclear power was about a third of the cost over a lifetime. So my question really is, in Germany in particular, which is with their policies to reduce nuclear down to nothing, where it has been, I think, about a quarter of their electricity production, do you see that there really is a future for nuclear, that it has made a big impact historically on CO2 production, and with the increasing urbanization that's projected for the world, where concentrated energy can be localized relatively close to cities, it seems to me that nuclear provides a very important alternative if we really want to try to get down CO2 levels. So there's a lot of issues about it, social acceptance, political issues, and money issues. So do you see that this really is pretty much just going to stay stable, or is there an option for this to expand twofold, for example, in the next 30 years?
So I'm not a physicist or engineer, but from a political or economic perspective, I don't see much chances for a big renewal of nuclear power. It's being phased out in the technologically most advanced countries, most of them, not this one yet, but a lot of countries in Europe and Japan, in Asia. It's being feared by a large chunk of the population in these countries because of a row of accidents. And of course, nobody can promise you that there will never be another accident. And I think, personally, from an environmental standpoint, as long as we don't know what to do with nuclear waste, which is going to be active thousands and thousands of years, me personally, I'm not a big fan of that. I don't think that's a good trade-off, a little less carbon against something like that in the mountain. So let me put it this way, it's of course a source of energy for countries who have a fear of being cut off from big distribution networks, to want to emphasize energy independence in that sense. But historically, energy independence is like food independence or autarky. It's an economic anachronism. Makes no sense when you look at an integrated world. So that won't help much. And I think the only thing which could trigger, as my personal view, is as good as yours, but the only thing which could trigger a big renaissance of nuclear would be some devastating early clear signs of climate change, which people in their heads, flooding or so, would relate to CO2 emission and would say, we need to do whatever it costs, whatever it takes, including nuclear, to switch tomorrow and not in 10 years. But otherwise, no.
So we may have time for one or two more questions.
Yes, hello. This is directed to the gentleman from Excel. As we talk about moral-based decisions on what to supplement for alternative energy sources, I think you guys actually have a great case study underway at this point with your wind source program. What percentage of your customers actually engage in wind source, and is that number of customers increasing or decreasing?
So wind source, for the rest of your information, it's one of the very first voluntary wind energy programs where customers can subscribe to it and supplant the system energy with energy from wind. We retire the renewable credits when customers participate and buy wind source energy, and we add more wind to make sure that it's above and beyond our standards. So it continues to grow. It was kind of flat for a while, but we do see it increasing. We have a settlement agreement before our Public Utilities Commission that would kind of to reflect the changing costs in the industry, that would reduce the cost from $2 per 100 kilowatt hours down to $1.30 per 100 kilowatt hours. So hopefully that will further increase participation. We've taken it across our 8-state footprint and provide it in most states, but it's still a pretty small percentage. I think it's about 4% of our customers that participate in Colorado. What's interesting is the difference between participation levels in some communities versus others, and it's very disparate.
One more question, maybe up here on the left.
I'm Dolores Williams, just a person who lives in Fort Collins, interested in these things. I'm not hearing where I used to that, electricity, you lose electricity, is it 20, 40% in transmission lines? And I thought we were going to more localized so that, when the entire country wouldn't go down. I know you have various ways of shutting off, but aren't we going to more local solar, wind, and not so many transmission lines?
David?
Yeah, so energy losses on a combined transmission and distribution system, so from generator to customer, typically range in the 6 to 8% range. So that's about right. If you just look at the economics, the cost of large-scale solar is probably, I'll just take liberty, probably about half what it costs to do rooftop solar. And that's largely due to differences in technologies like fixed panels versus tracking panels on larger installations. So from an economic standpoint, large-scale renewables win out. I think some of the things that will drive changes are more specific customer wants, that they want the solar in their community, they want the project in their neighborhood, they want it on their roof, but also resilience, microgrids, as we add batteries to the picture, over the coming decade, we'll still see an increase in local generation, a significant increase. That battle will be really interesting to watch how that develops, because we're going to add a ton of renewables in the next 5 to 10 years. And today, local generation, for us in Colorado, it's about 2%, whereas large-scale generation is about 20%. So a lot to come on that.
So in summary, we've had a session that really, I think, was a good discussion across scales, where you had regional all the way out to international discussions around the challenges in meeting these goals that were aggressively set in Paris. We talked about things in infrastructure, innovation, and behavior, and these are important topics in looking at the mega trends that we face in meeting the glass half full and the half empty kind of approach to our thinking. I want to thank our panelists and thank you for your attention this morning, and invite you to stay tuned for the next session on the Western region energy issues. Thank you very much.